one that's...
And I think what's interesting too is that it seems nowadays that most short stories are in that sort of kit form, and that's so in a sense is he was, I guess, I don't think maybe necessarily groundbreaker, but ahead of his time in that respect, and that is the dominant form today, I think. Many of the Nick Adams stories were some of them were written in Paris in the 20s during the Lost Generation era. And what's interesting is reading Hemingway's A Movable Feast, which is his memoir about Paris in the 20s, is he talks about actually writing about Michigan in Paris. So I don't know about you, but if I were in Paris, I probably would be writing about Paris. But it's interesting that I think he felt he wasn't far enough removed from it. But the idea that there he is in this, maybe this really important, incredible cultural era, there he is in Paris writing about Michigan.
So you have a problem with writing about Kalkaska and Mansalona and Petoskey when you're sitting in a Parisian cafe?
Not at all.
Well, and he says that in Movable Feast. He says you have to be removed from a place before you can write well about it. Maybe someday he could write well about Paris once he was removed from that. But allegedly he had a map of northern Michigan tacked up on the wall of his room. He was working his brain to capture those vignettes, as Fred says, moving the pieces around on the canvas, looking at the Impressionist paintings. How can he remove words and still tell the story? And I think of teaching high school kids the Nick Adams stories, and they get done and they say, they get this kind of dismal look on their face, and they say, "What happened? Nothing happened." And you start to say, well, wait a minute. If we go back to the traditional forms of conflict in a story, man versus man versus nature, blah, 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 all of a sudden you realize, oh, there's an awful lot that happened in that sketchbook. But he is plucking and pulling. He's using that memory of Michigan as a canvas, the people, the places, and he's weaving them together, removed from it. So he's not overwhelmed by the reality of it. He can selectively choose and pull out what he wants.
One of the more, I guess, iconic short stories of the Nick Adams stories, The Killers, and this foreshadows the next panel, which deals more with, I guess, maybe noir fiction or crime novels, is that The Killers is this sort of, I don't know, when I read it I was like, wow, this reminds me of all these, different mystery genres and different movies that I've seen regarding, those sorts of, that, I guess, 1940s sort of short, snappy dialogue, and but The Killers is set in Illinois, but I recently learned that it was actually originally in a draft somewhere else. So one of the great Nick Adams stories was, again, we can't claim that it's Michigan's, but in fact there's a little bit of backstory here.
I think that's my cue, because he and I talked about this before the panel.
That wasn't very subtle, was it?
No, you weren't at all. One of the things Hemingway was respectful of was good editing. And in 3 stories that I know of, but I'm not the lit expert, these gentlemen are that, but in A Movable Feast, in The Killers, and in Indian Camp, Hemingway wrote a story, he looked back at it, and he said, you know what, back to removing things from the canvas, if I just lop off the first bit and start the story in process, it becomes a better story. In Indian Camp, he cuts off 3 shots. So if you've read the Nick Adams stories, 3 shots was originally together with it. He just lops it off and starts it in the middle of the story, so you're in the middle of the stream before you know it. The Killers that we think of in Summit, there was a little town outside of Chicago called Summit. It's a gangster story. You don't associate gangsters with Petoskey. But in his original draft of the story, it is indeed set in Petoskey. Nick Adams comes out of the rail station after buying a newspaper. He looks across Little Traverse Bay at Harbor Springs. It's a cold winter day and the wind is blowing. He huddles down and the wind is going sideways almost, and the snow is almost going sideways. Goes into the lunchroom and begins a dialogue, and then Hemingway cuts it. And all of a sudden he picks up the real Killer story, his final version, with the dialogue already in the diner, and you not knowing that it really is. And in the original manuscripts, you have Petoskey crossed out and Summit written in for that later section. And so I think, Northern Michigan inspired him in lots of different ways. If I'm not mistaken, that story was written in Madrid. So as he sat in Madrid, he's writing about a cold, wintry day in northern Michigan, coming out of the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad station, looking across the frozen bay at Harbor Springs.
Incidentally, if you want to know when and how these stories were written, there's a wonderful book which you can't get because everybody's gotten their copy, but you can find it in libraries. It's edited by Paul Smith, who was one of the original presidents of the International Hemingway Society, and it has information day by day on most of the stories and when they're being put together. So get to the library, look for Paul Smith, and I believe it's called Just a Reader's Guide to the Short Fiction of Ernest Hemingway. I could be wrong about that title.
Along those lines, a little bit of Michigan and other Hemingway's works. Is that the wilderness of Who the Bell Tolls, or?
I don't think he ever leaves Michigan in a sense. I mean, he's a man with a wonderful memory. During his second safari to Africa, his then wife Mary was keeping a diary, and afterwards she said, "Look, Ernest, I have this wonderful diary." And Ernest said, "Well, that's nice." And they didn't always have a wonderful relationship, so I think he did say, "Well, that's nice," and not really mean it. And she said, "Well, I thought you could use it because when you sit down and write about this, as I know you will, I have all the days and the facts and the times and the temperatures and all of that." And he said, "Oh, well, name a day." And she named a day. And he said, "Okay, well, in the morning we got up, we ate this, we did that," and he had a great memory. One of the things that may have led to his suicide is the electroshock therapy that wiped out his memory, which was his stock in trade as a writer. He could remember the way things were, and then he could remember what had made the emotion in that and make his writing come together. Back to the idea of his memory of Michigan. If you go to the places that Hemingway lived, if you go to his house in Sun Valley, it's cottage. It's built out of concrete to make it look like wood, but it's a cottage. If you go to his house in the suburbs of Havana on a hilltop, looking out over Havana, and you walk in, aside from the fact that it's stucco, it's just like being in a Michigan cottage. It has that floor plan without halls. It's 2 rooms deep. You can open all of the windows and all of the doors, and the breeze sweeps through, and it's just as if it has been brought from northern Michigan and adapted. So I don't think he ever really leaves northern Michigan. I think it's always with him. And that sense of wilderness and that sense of things lost, the 19th century earlier wonderful wilderness Michigan that's gone by the time he arrives. That feeling is in a lot of Hemingway. There's a lot of loss in Hemingway, and a lot of it comes from Michigan.
There's a hand back here. Go ahead.
Could you speak a little bit about his connection with
The question was to speak about the Hemingway's interactions with Native Americans in the area.
We're fighting over who doesn't have to answer this question. I think Fred earlier talked about that Hemingway wrote about a generation earlier in northern Michigan, and in his mind, he was a product of that generation that saw Pawnee Bill's Wild West show and was aware of Native Americans through the legends and the rumors. But the Native Americans Ernest would have known would have been the Indians that camped around and stayed around, worked in the tanneries around northern Michigan. They would have been the Indian families, Native American families that gathered berries and came to the house and sold those berries. They would have been Native Americans would have been hired to, clean up brush. He knew Native Americans, but they weren't nearly the romantic kind of Native American images that were in his head. They were real people with real problems, and depending on your interpretation of stories, his relationships with the Native Americans, particularly the Native American women, may have been more advanced or not. But we know he knew Native Americans like he knew northern Michigan people and was associated with them in that way at least.
At one of our meetings of the Michigan Hemingway Society, we meet the end of October. This is not a plug because Mike's going to do the plug later, but we actually have a weekend where we go to the Prairie Hotel, and we had somebody who had come in from out of state and said, well, where are the Native Americans? Where are they gone? There aren't any left. you know, they're lost people. And I think one of the things he does is to convince us that they aren't lost people. And it was very interesting because I was sitting at a table in the elegant dining room of the Perry Hotel as this person was doing the diatribe about how all of the Native Americans were gone and they were lost. And our waitress was a Native American, and she wasn't wearing beads and fringe and feathers, but she was there. And that has always been the answer, the same answer that Mike just gave you. I mean, the Native Americans have always been there. They may not be standing out and waving at us and acting in Hiawatha pageants, which they did do during Hemingway's time, but they're there. They're a part of northern Michigan. I think Hemingway knew that.
Go ahead.
I'd like you to comment on what your favorite Nick Adams story is and
The
why.
the question was your favorite Nick Adams story.
I think I like Big Two-Hearted River because it gets at a lot of, I think, personal complexity, and you get a sense of someone who's trying to deal with the complexities in his life by simplifying, by doing one thing and sort of rebuilding himself and rebuilding his psyche, one little piece at a time, managed very carefully. And there's a great poignancy to that. I think it suggests how much damage has been done, and I like where it comes out. There's more to be done, but he doesn't go off and fish the swamp at the end. He said there will be plenty of other days to fish the swamp. I'm not there yet. I really like that touch.
Well, now that Tom took that story, I'll take the next one, and then we'll leave the third one for Mike. Another of my yes, another of my favorites is Fathers and Sons. It's one of the last of them, and it's where Nick Adams is an adult. He is a writer. He's driving through the South, and next to him on the front seat of the car, asleep, is his son. And you have to remember the title stolen from Turgenev is Fathers and Sons, plural. His son is asleep next to him, and we sort of forget that through the story because Nick looks out and he looks at the landscape and he imagines how he might hunt that landscape. And it's apparently a place where you go to hunt for birds. So Tom actually could be talking about this because he's the bird hunter here. Although sometimes he says he's going out, date with a shotgun and some sort of bird or a smallmouth bass, and often the smallmouth bass doesn't show up, only the fly rye shows up, but it's still a good experience. So he's very good on this. But Nick looks at that landscape and he starts to remember his father, and most of the story is Nick remembering his father, who ended much like Ernest's father, who committed suicide. A pattern in the Hemingway family, unfortunately, a lot of suicide in his family. And Nick Adams, the character, and Ernest Hemingway, through his character Nick Adams, evokes Dr. Adams and evokes, I think, indirectly, Dr. Hemingway. And there are all of the wonderful, wonderful things that were taught to Nick by his father. But there are also the things that are not so good. The explanations of sex apparently were not very good. Dr. Adams talks about mashing and how it's a heinous crime. And Nick, remembers as a child thinking that he wanted to try that once, but he didn't know what you do with the potato masher. So there's all the sides of that father, the wonderful sides and the absurd sides. I mean, the doctor who knew everything about sex, who was an obstetrician but couldn't tell his father, the father couldn't tell the son anything about sexuality because he was a Victorian. And the story evokes the father, Dr. Adams, and the son, Nick Adams, wonderfully. And then at the very end, something interesting happens. Nick Adams' son, the 7-year-old, about the age that Nick Adams is in the first Nick Adams stories, he wakes up. And they start to talk about Dr. Adams. And the son wants to know about his grandfather. And Nick finds that even though he can remember all of this, that somehow he cannot tell his son what he remembers and what he knows and what is important. And we see that pattern repeated. All of the things that Dr. Adams could not tell his son Nick. Nick cannot tell his son, and it's a wonderful story, and it tells us a lot. I can say this as a father of 2 sons, about how difficult communication can be, even with the greatest love, and even with the greatest understanding. How do you get that across to the next generation?
Right, I get to follow that.
That's why I took that story, Mike.
All right, I'll get back at you both. I would say the one I find most interesting was one that Hemingway never published in his lifetime. It was still stewing, but it's in the Nick Adams stories. And it's the selection called On Writing. Nick Adams stories are made up of stories that were published. Hemingway authorized it, fine, published it. And it's also made up of bits and pieces that he was still working over. You know, he had to turn the soil a bit more in some of these stories to get them ready to publish. And there are a number of selections in the Nick Adams stories that never got to that point with him, that he would return to, he would tinker with, who weren't quite ready. I like On Writing as a Michiganian because in it he talks about Michigan. He talks about writing, he talks about Nick Adams and how nothing, you should believe nothing, that Nick Adams was not him, that Nick Adams Ernest Hemingway had never seen a Caesarean section of a Native American. He made it all up. I mean, Ernest tells us through Nick's voice, I made it all up. And then he goes on to list the things that he loved about northern Michigan. So if you look there, you'll find the genesis of stories that never were officially or formally written, but you'll find a great snapshot of our state.
One last question. I think we're just about out of time.
I'm surprised that I know the gentleman from Hemingway. I'm surprised we didn't get My Old Man. If you look at it, 9 pages, and they made 4 movies out of it. Where else can you find a limited amount of material lined up and telling 4 different movies?
Can I do my shameless plug now?
Yeah.
The Michigan Hemingway Society is a very select group of individuals. We don't let just anybody into it. You have to have $10 in order to become a member. We are a mixture of school teachers, of professors, of people who just like to go to Petoskey and shop or see the colors in the fall, spouses who are dragged along against their will. We're an organization that does not take itself too seriously, which we think is very important. Every year we hold an annual conference in Petoskey, October 24 through 26 this year. The theme is Hemingway and Friends. Valerie Hemingway, who has toured the state and talked before about her father-in-law, Ernest. Valerie was Ernest's secretary first, and then she was his daughter-in-law. Valerie Hemingway is one of our speakers. Paul Hendrickson is another of our speakers. It's a great excuse to go to Petoskey for a long weekend. I have some note cards that announce that if you want to stop by and grab one of those when you're done. Also, thanks to the Great Michigan Reads Project, there was a DVD produced last summer, Ernest Hemingway Life in Michigan, 30-minute DVD. It's aired on public broadcasting stations around the state. You may have seen it. It stars Fred as the leading spokesman, so that's a good thing or not. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Copies are available from the Michigan Hemingway Society. We have a website. If you log on, you'll find us. Just do a Google and you'll find us there. We would love to have you join us in the fall, and we publish a newsletter as well, so if you're not able to attend the conference, do check the website and be in touch with us. We don't take ourselves too seriously. Hemingway and Friends. We're going to talk about the Northern Michigan Friends and other friends. So tours of the area, there are lots of fun things we would like to invite you to be a part of.
Thanks, Mike. Please, a round of applause for our panelists.